Hi, everyone. This is part 2 of module number 4. In this section, we're going to talk a little bit about the effects of the revolution on slavery, because all these revolutionary ideas that we talked about in the last clip are going to pose some pretty significant challenges to the traditional hierarchical order. If you can overthrow the monarchy, then all of these other traditional hierarchical ties are potentially at risk. There's potentially a challenge to all kinds of authority, political structure, religious authority, and in particular, I think all this revolutionary ideology and this talk about equality and the role of government and the rights of citizens, it's going to prompt a shift in thinking about slavery. The revolution has emphasized liberty and freedom, and it makes the system of slavery very conspicuous because slavery is obviously the opposite of all of those ideas. It makes it possible for people to confront slavery as an anomaly in ways that they would not have been able to conceive of even just 10 or 15 years earlier. There's a contradiction here in fighting for freedom and liberty and yet holding other human beings as slaves. And this contradiction is going to lead to a crisis of conscience for many people. There's a window of opportunity in the 1770s and 80s in which efforts to abolish slavery do have some support and some success. But as you can see here in the slide, and as we'll see in the next few minutes, different parts of the country are going to handle this issue in different ways. In New England states, slaves themselves are taking active roles in pushing for their own freedom. And the main way they're doing this is by turning to the courts. Slaves are suing for their freedom based on this revolutionary rhetoric. They're filing freedom suits, making their claims for freedom very public, and also calling their masters and leaders to account. They're saying, if you really believe all of these ideas that you've been talking about, that all men are created equal, well, then put your money where your mouth is. You have a moral obligation to follow through and to set us free. Just to give you one example, the woman that you see in this slide, she was a Massachusetts slave woman named Elizabeth Freeman, or sometimes she was called Mumbet. Her master had been involved in a lot of revolutionary activity in the 1770s. And so she'd heard a lot of these ideas and this language being discussed by her master and his buddies. The idea all men are created equal, the language of the Declaration. The last straw for her came in 1781. Her mistress tried to hit her sister or her daughter, we're not sure which, tried to hit her with a shovel. Elizabeth got in the way and demanded an apology from her mistress. And when she didn't get one, she walked out of the house. She walked several miles in the snow to the home of one of her master's buddies, one of these lawyers that she'd heard involved in all these discussions. He agrees to take her case, and they sue her master for her freedom. And the court is going to come back and rule that Freeman is not the legal property of her master under the new Massachusetts state constitution. The court is going to award her her freedom. And you can see here in the quote just how important this is to her. She says, while I was a slave, if 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me, and I had been told that I would have to die at the end of that minute, I would have taken it, just to stand 1 minute on God's earth a free woman. So we see Elizabeth Freeman, a number of other slaves, pursuing their freedom in the courts. In the 1780s, a number of New England slaves are going to win these freedom suits and gain their freedom. So in New England, slavery is coming to an end in the 1780s through these kinds of judicial actions. In other parts of the North, the middle states, places like New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, there is also support for emancipation there. But the way that this policy is going to be pursued is a little bit different. In these areas, they're pursuing a policy called gradual emancipation, which is basically what it sounds like. It's the idea of freeing slaves slowly over an extended period of time. So the way these laws would work is that they would typically specify a date. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, January the 1st, 1790. If someone was born into slavery before that date, under these laws, they're going to remain a slave. But if someone is born into slavery after that date, they will gain their freedom, but not until they reach adulthood. And the law would usually specify an age of adulthood. So it might be 21. Pennsylvania is actually as late as age 28. So think about the math involved here for a second. Let's say the date says 1790, but you don't gain your freedom until you're 21 years old. That means the earliest someone would gain their freedom might be 1811. And it's going to be a rolling process from that point onward. So we're going to see slavery still continuing, even in parts of the North, well into the 1800s, the 1830s, 1840s. Now we'll talk in a moment about why they're dragging it out like this. If you're going to free slaves, why not just do it all at once? Why stretch it out like this? But we'll come back to that. Even in parts of the South, the upper South, places like Virginia and Maryland, there was support for emancipation in some form in the 1770s and 80s. State governments in this area are going to resist laws that affect all slaves in the state. Instead, they're going to pass what were called manumission laws, which basically transferred that decision to individual masters. So if individual slave owners felt that crisis of conscience and wanted to free their slaves, these manumission laws made it possible for them to do so. And actually, before that point, it was very difficult to free slaves. You would have to get an act of the legislature to authorize it. So this is allowing masters to free slaves if they want to. It's also allowing slaves themselves to purchase their own freedom. And we do see a number of masters actually doing this. But by contrast, what's happening in the Deep South, places like South Carolina and Georgia, there's opposition to any kind of emancipation. In fact, South Carolina wants to expand the slave trade. So what's happening in the Deep South is very much out of step with this larger trend in much of the rest of the nation. So, during and immediately after the Revolution, there was support in many parts of the nation for emancipation. But by the 1790s, that abolitionist window has started to close. And I think there's three real reasons for this. For one, economic considerations. This was one of the reasons why states only passed gradual emancipation measures. I think it gets at one of the fundamental contradictions of slavery, that slaves are both people and property at the same time. So from the master's standpoint, if you free slaves, if you set people free, you're taking away master's property. And remember, these are people who just fought a war against Britain because they believe that Britain was threatening their property rights. So they don't want to see their own new governments doing the same thing. These masters are saying, if you're going to free our slave property, we want compensation for that loss. And this raises a real question of, well, where would the money come from? Because we're talking about an enormous amount of capital that is invested in slaves. There's no way for the government to raise enough money to pay off masters what they think they're owed. So this question of compensation becomes a major stumbling block in terms of abolishing slavery. We also start to see some social tensions rising in the 1780s and 90s. We're seeing a lot of challenges to the new government, not just from slaves, but from a wide range of common people, as we'll see in some later segments here. Leaders are starting to feel like all these ideas about liberty and equality, that they're going too far, that people are pushing the envelope too far down that road. In 1791, a violent slave rebellion in Haiti also gave white masters in the US a pretty terrifying prospect of what might happen if those demands for liberty were taken to their logical conclusion. This is actually going to prompt slave owners to start cracking down on their slave population and trying to assert control over slaves rather than easing restrictions. But then finally, I think probably the most significant blow to this whole abolitionist moment had to do with a technological innovation. And that was Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793. Before this point, there wasn't a great deal of cotton production being done in the US, largely because the type of cotton that grows really well has really sticky seeds. And so in order to process the cotton so that it can be turned into fabric, you'd have to pick out all those sticky seeds by hand. This is a very time-consuming, very labor-intensive activity. So it was a real big obstacle to growing cotton on a large scale successfully. The cotton gin is going to change that. This was a really simple machine. You can see here in the picture, it's got this cylinder in the middle with little teeth on it and a crank attached to it. What you do here is that you would feed the picked cotton in as you're turning the crank. All those teeth are going to pick the seeds out. So what you have coming out the other side is processed cotton that's ready to be shipped off to textile mills. completely removes that processing bottleneck. So now you can grow as much cotton as you want, depending on how much land you have and how many workers you have to grow the crop. We see a boom in cotton cultivation in the South. As white Southerners start expanding westward into places like Georgia and Alabama and Texas, they're taking cotton production with them, and they're taking slavery with them to serve as the primary labor force to grow this crop. So, I think there's this moment right around the revolution where there's this chance to actually end slavery once and for all, but it doesn't reach fruition in all parts of the nation. And we're going to see that even while they're trying to build a unified nation, different regions are starting to move along different lines. So slavery is coming to an end in the North, whereas in the South, it's only gaining renewed momentum and actually becomes the cornerstone of the South's economy going forward into the 1800s, something that we'll pick up on in some later modules.